Okay, so today we are talking about the ventricular system of the brain. So you can see over here, this is the lateral ventricle. There are two lateral ventricles. This is a transverse section of the brain which is taken, and so you can see the two lateral ventricle, and then there are two lateral ventricles. So this is the central part of the lateral ventricle which will be containing cerebrospinal fluid. So now we are going to show you the parts. So this is the anterior horn. So the central part will go anteriorly within the frontal lobe. There is an extension where we are putting the forceps inside, is the anterior horn of the lateral ventricle into the frontal lobe of the cerebrum. These lateral ventricles are cavities containing CSF within the cerebral hemispheres. Yes, so that is the posterior part, and then that goes into inferiorly to form the inferior horn of the lateral ventricle. That is the anterior horn, inferior horn, that is the posterior horn. So posterior horn goes into the occipital lobe, inferior horn which we are showing now goes into the temporal lobe. So that goes into the frontal lobe, occipital lobe and temporal lobe. So that is the inferior horn. So you can see over here a cluster, yes, of blood vessels that is called the choroid plexus, which is actually formed by the pia mater opposed with the ependyma called the choroid plexus, thelachoroidae, and forming the choroid plexus, which contains a tuft of blood vessels which secretes the cerebrospinal fluid. It's very important for formation of cerebrospinal fluid. Yes, so these are the three horns, and you have this is the tuft of blood vessels which is in the floor of the central part of the lateral ventricle, and it continues to the roof of the inferior horn of the lateral ventricle. So this is what is the very clear view you can see over here of the choroid plexus. Very important for formation of cerebrospinal fluid. So cerebrospinal fluid is formed. Okay, so that was the other side, and both the sides lateral ventricle is separated from each other by the septum pellucidum. So that is the septum pellucidum. Now we go to another section, that is the sagittal section. So this is the sagittal section. You can see the lateral ventricle very clearly. That is the choroid plexus which is in the floor of the central part just above the thalamus. So this is the septum pellucidum which separates one side of the lateral ventricle from the other side of the lateral ventricle. So you have two lateral ventricles within the cerebral hemispheres. Yes, so that forms the floor, that is the fornix. So you can see over here, that is the fornix. Okay, so that and the septum pellucidum is attached to the fornix. The septum pellucidum is attached to the fornix. So that is the central part, and now we are showing you the interventricular foramen. The lateral ventricles will communicate with the third ventricle through this interventricular foramen of Monro. So this is the interventricular foramen. The lateral ventricles are communicating with the third ventricle. So intercommunicating and also communicating with the third ventricle. So that is what is the third ventricle. So you can see the third ventricle which is medial to the thalamus. Okay, so that is the thalamus. You can see we are showing you the thalamus which is in the lateral wall of the third ventricle. There is only one third ventricle, and that is the hypothalamus. So thalamus, hypothalamus, mainly that is the thalamus and hypothalamus are separated from each other by the hypothalamic sulcus. So that is the hypothalamic sulcus, and that is the interventricular foramen over there. Yes, so that is actually the third ventricle is continuing with the aqueduct of Sylvius. That is the hypothalamus, and that is the thalamus and hypothalamic sulcus. So now coming to this section, we are seeing the roof of the third ventricle. So that is the third ventricle. Roof of the third ventricle has the choroid plexus with the ependyma. So that is the ependyma, pia mater opposed with the ependyma, forming the thelachoroidae, and which has the tuft of blood vessels within it, and that is called the choroid plexus. Very important for formation of cerebrospinal fluid. Now when we come to this section, this is again a sagittal section, that is the thalamus. We can see over here. So the third ventricle will have following boundaries. You have a floor of the third ventricle, and you have the posterior wall of the third ventricle. So that more or less forms the posterior wall of the third ventricle, and there you have the epithalamus. So that is the, you have all the things. So thalamus, hypothalamus and epithalamus. So that is the fornix or the roof. Below the roof you are getting the choroid plexus of the third ventricle. Choroid plexus of the third ventricle. Yes, so over here you have the epithalamus, and then you have the anterior wall, the floor, anterior wall, and also the posterior wall. So that forms the posterior wall of the third ventricle. So this is basically, we are showing you the third ventricle. There is only one third ventricle, remember that, bounded laterally by two thalami. So coming to the lateral wall of the third ventricle, this is the interthalamic adhesion fibers. Interthalamic adhesion fibers. The two thalami of the either side are connected with each other by the interthalamic adhesion fibers. Now coming to the anterior wall, what are the structures? That is the anterior commissure. We can see the anterior commissure, and you also have the basically the fornix, which will have the columns of the fornix. So that is the column of the fornix you can see over here, and that is the lamina terminalis. So mainly the anterior commissure, the columns of the fornix, and lamina terminalis. That is the lamina terminalis. That part is the lamina terminalis. Now we come to the posterior wall. So you can see this is the stalk of the pineal gland. So pineal gland is situated there. Yes, exactly. And that is the stalk of the pineal gland. So this is the posterior wall of the third ventricle. Pineal gland is important because it secretes melatonin, which will very important for sleep-wake cycle. Maintaining the sleep-wake cycle. Yes, so that is the stalk of the pineal gland. So that is very important in the posterior wall of the third ventricle. Next we are coming down. So we can see the posterior commissure. So you can see here the posterior commissure, which is a part of the posterior wall. Now we will go to the floor of the third ventricle. So this forms the floor of the third ventricle. So for that we will use another section. Yes, here the floor is very clear. So you can see this is the optic tract, the optic chiasma. So that, and then you are having the infundibulum or the tuberous cinerarium of the pituitary gland. So optic chiasma, infundibulum, tuberous cinerarium of the pituitary gland, tuberous cinerarium and infundibulum. And this is the mammillary body. This is the mammillary body, and here you have the posterior perforated substance. So all these structures are the contents of the interpeduncular fossa, comes in the floor of the third ventricle, and this is the tegmentum of the midbrain. Tegmentum of the midbrain is also in the floor, and you can see the third ventricle is continuing down along the, yes, so that is the entire thing is the floor of the third ventricle. So aqueduct of Sylvius, that is the third ventricle, and that is the lateral ventricle. You can see over here very clearly the central part of the lateral ventricle, and just below the corpus callosum, that is the interventricular foramen, from where the cerebrospinal fluid will come to the third ventricle, then through the aqueduct it will reach into the fourth ventricle. So it is seen very well just in front of the cerebellum. You can see the triangular fourth ventricle. Yes, that is the aqueduct and that is the fourth ventricle. Okay, so